This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you want to pre-order some Bloomburrow, use my link in the description. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and it's Saturday. That means it's time for Nitsa Notes, my weekly vlog series about limited Magic. I just did my Bloomburrow set review, so that's complete. If you haven't watched it yet, I've talked about every card in the format, including the special guests. And I've also done a few drafts. The first couple are up. They're from the early access event. The last one will go up tomorrow that I recorded during the early access event. And as usual, during this first week of the format, early access, pre-release, etc., I like to put out a video on Saturday with my picks for the best commons and uncommons in the set. It's kind of a Cliff's Notes version of my set review. The commons and uncommons are what's important, and they're what you're going to see a lot of in your sealed pools and whatnot. So, it's worth taking a look at this sort of thing, especially if you don't have time to watch my whole set review or whatever. So, let's get started with white. I think white's third best common is Waxwane Witness. 4 mana for a 2/4 flying vigilance is right on rate. That's pretty good for what you're paying in limited. It attacks reasonably hard in the sky, and it also hangs back and blocks. It has high enough toughness that it's not that easy to bust through with combat tricks, and it has high enough toughness that it's not that easy to kill with most removal spells in the format. So it's not like 4 mana 2/2 flyers are often liabilities because they can be destroyed for 1 mana. That's generally not going to happen here unless your opponent has Swords to Plowshares or something. But if they have that, they have it, right? So, but the Witness overall is just a good body, but it also has something else going on that's different from the other payoffs for gaining and losing life in this format. And that is that it triggers every time you gain life. So if you gain life twice in a turn, it's a 4/4. And just once is a 3/4. Most of the other cards that pay you off for it say if you've gained or lost life this turn, X happens. Not true here. So you can potentially buff it multiple times in a turn. And it does attack as a Sarah Angel, effectively. I've seen it happen a couple of times already. And, it's not a great card or anything, but I do think it's white's third best common. It's just got nice stats and nice upside. I think white's second best common is Banishing Light. We see this all the time. Removal, I've talked about this some, especially in draft videos and stuff. 1-for-1 removal is less good than it used to be because we live in a world now where there are so many creatures that give you some sort of value before you can ever kill it. So you don't really trade 1-for-1 as often as one used to. Creatures used to mostly attack and block in limited, right? It's not as true anymore. They've entered the battlefield abilities. They have leave the battlefield abilities. They have static abilities. They do something a lot of the time before you ever get a chance to remove them. And so Banishing Light isn't as good as it used to be, but it can go after any non-land permanent, and it does exile, so it gets around graveyard shenanigans and death triggers at least. Sure, it can get destroyed. That's always the downside with one of these, but if you've ever played with Banishing Light or Oblivion Ring or any of these cards, you know that, yeah, that downside exists, but the upside is very much worth it. And I do think Banishing Light is something you can first pick, though I'm not ecstatic about it. And I think white's best common is Intrepid Rabbit. This is one of these creatures that it doesn't actually feel that good to remove because you can either pay 3 mana for a 3/2 that buffs one of your creatures, or 4 mana for a 3/2 and a 1/1 that each buff a couple of your creatures. So yeah, using removal on this doesn't feel very good because, especially if they offspring, because you have 2 bodies and now, they're both doing ETB things. And there's just so much synergy going on here. In addition to this being a good rate, in any format, 4 mana for a 3/2 and a 1/1 that have these ETBs would be a good common. But then you have a few things going on in the format that make them even better. One of them is that white really likes to go wide. There are lots of cards that pay you off for going wide with rabbits in particular, and this card does it all on its own. And it also works with Valiant, which is mostly a red-white thing, but triggering Valiant on 1 creature with this is good. Sometimes you can do it with 2. You just get so much value out of a common when you play Intrepid Rabbit. And that's why I think it's the best common, and that's why I think it's even better than Banishing Light. Banishing Light doesn't feel too bad against Waxwane Witness, at least, right? Because it doesn't do anything inherently when it enters the battlefield or whatever. But there are a lot of Intrepid Rabbits out there that the Banishing Lights aren't so good against anymore. And I think white's best uncommon is Drift Gloom Coyote. So once you have a creature that does the Banishing Light type thing, it's way, way better. We've seen that so many times, Banisher Priest and the like. This one's more expensive than most of them, but it's still a 5-mana 3/4 that exiles your opponent's best creature. And sometimes you'll have to exile something that's small. That'll be your best move anyway. There are some scary small creatures in the format. And the Coyote might be even bigger. Now, your opponent does, again, have the ability to get back the creature at some point. And it's more likely when we're talking about a creature. I mean, creature removal is more common than enchantment removal. But again, the downside is well worth it. You know, you get a creature out of the way, no questions asked, more or less, and it makes a big difference the turn you play it. And if your opponent, even if your opponent does kill your Coyote, you're not ending up behind at all. You know, they just kill it, they get their thing back, but you've gained a lot of advantage just from removing that thing for a turn. And if they don't kill it, I mean, the game is often over when Driftgloom Coyote is cast. And yeah, I mean, it's definitely first pickable. Let's move now to blue, where I think the third best common is Finch Formation. So 3-mana 2/2 flyer gives flying to something else when it enters the battlefield. It's not ultra exciting. I do think it's good enough to be blue's third best common, but it does sort of slot nicely into the blue-white deck in the format, which likes flyers and not having flyers. And this can give, you know, obviously giving flying to something that already has flying isn't that useful, but giving something real flying is pretty good. And then in the late game, this has this additional upside where you sink more mana into it. You also get a 1/1 flyer. And like we saw with Intrepid Rabbit, although it's a lot less efficient about it, it gives you 2 triggers. Those can trigger Valiant. You know, should you be playing blue-red or blue-white, it's a pretty good chance you have cards with Valiant that this can trigger, or just nice creatures to give flying until end of turn. I think blue's second best common is Light Shell Duo. I just think this does a lot for the cost. You know, 4-mana 3/4 with Prowess and Surveil 2 on ETB. You know, all of these duos are supposed to kind of slot in nicely to 2 different decks in the format. They're each 1 color and have 2 creature types that go with different decks. Like this one goes with blue-red and blue-black because it's a rat otter. The Surveil helps you with Threshold in blue-black, and the Prowess helps you with spell stuff in blue-red. 4-mana 3/4 that only Surveil 2 on ETB would be kind of an okay card, and 4-mana 3/4 with Prowess would be too. Slapping them both on 1 card makes for a pretty solid common. I'm not super pumped about either of these as, like, commons I'm going to take ultra early, but they're both commons that, like, the first copies pretty much always making the cut for me. And I think blue's best common is Dire Downdraft. You know, just this sort of 1-for-1 removal. I don't quite think it's premium. It would need to be a little bit cheaper, but you often pay 3. You put a creature either on top of your opponent's library or on the bottom. They do make the choice. You don't. But that often is like a really good removal effect. And you can even get 2-for-1s out of it if your opponent tries to use tricks or things like that. And that really can be a blowout. But at a minimum, it's reasonably efficient 1-for-1 removal that, you know, you're going to play a couple copies of in like every blue deck. I also, again, don't love first picking it, but I do think it's pretty good. So blue, I think, is kind of shallow in the quality of its commons, at least at this early stage in the format. I feel that way. But I think it makes up for that in uncommons, because I had a pretty hard time choosing blue's best uncommon. I think it's between Daring Wave Rider, Night Fisher, and Plume Creed Escort. The Wave Rider is the 6-mana 4/4 that lets you cast a 4-mana or less spell from your graveyard when it enters the battlefield. So generally, it's a 6-mana 4/4 that casts a removal spell from your graveyard, so it usually destroys a creature. That's a really good rate. Night Fisher is a 5-mana 4/5 flyer, which is a reasonable enough rate. Anytime you play a bird, or have one enter the battlefield rather, you get a fish token, so that's some serious value on top of a good flyer. And then Plume Creed Escort, you know, it's more situational than the other 2 maybe, but it's going to create some super swingy plays where you effectively pay 2 mana, blank a removal spell, basically counter it, and add a 2/1 flyer to the board for 2 mana. Like, there are going to be some big blowouts. There are going to be times where you just have to fly it out there as a 2-mana 2/1 flyer. But in terms of ceiling, it might even be higher than the Wave Rider or Night Fisher is, just because of how devastating that kind of play is. I mean, it's a 2-for-1. So all 3 of those are great uncommons that, starting the format, I'd be pretty happy to first pick any of them. So, you know, I had an easier time figuring out what the best uncommon was in every other color, but I also think the other colors probably have better commons than blue does at this stage in the format. So let's move now to black, where I think the third best common is Ravine Raider. So 1-mana 1/1 Menace. You know, if you could play that on turn 1 every game, you definitely would. Like, you'd be pretty happy to do it. It's just such a good rate for what it is. And then it does exactly what the black-red aggro decks wants you to do, which is it gets in for easy hits on like turn 2. It can set up some really crazy starts where you play the 2-mana 2/2 that makes a black and a red on turn 2, and then you drop another 2-drop, and suddenly you have 3 creatures on the board. One of them has Menace. It can really set things up for you nicely. And on top of that, it has this like late game upside where it can just be buffed to the moon. And that kind of effect has played pretty well in Limited in the past when the creature it's on is small. If it's like a super inefficient creature, like, you know, a Shade, 5 mana 1/1 Shade or something, with this, it's not nearly as good. But when it's a 1 mana 1/1, it's a lot better. I mean, it makes it very difficult for it to be blocked. So it's really good on turn 1. But it stays relevant all game long because of its ability to buff itself. So it's a nice little common, you know, we've seen lots of good 1-drops lately. I think this is yet another one. I think Black's second best common is Savor. 2 mana for -2/-2 at instant speed. It's not the most amazing rate, but that's a card you usually always play in Limited. And then it adds the food on top of it, which is significant in this format. The food is useful if you're the Black-White Bats deck because you want to gain life. The food's significant if you're the black-green deck because you want to forage. So it ends up giving you more than a card of value most of the time, even if it's not the most efficient removal spell ever. And then I think Black's best common is just Nocturnal Hunger. You know, I was talking about how removal is not as good as it used to be, and it's definitely true. But when it's relatively cheap and instant speed and easy to cast, it's still pretty good. You know, like Nocturnal Hunger, 3 mana, destroy target creature, and it doesn't have the double black thing going on that has held Murder back in recent times. It's just 2 generic and a black. You do lose 2 life, unless you give your opponent a food. Most of the time, you're just going to lose the 2 life. And doing that has synergy with the black-white deck. Like, if you have your Waxwing Witness in play and you cast this, it gets +1/+0 until end of turn. So, losing life is just as good as gaining life for most of the cards in that deck. So, in addition to just being a card that, like, you'd play the first one of every time and that you would take relatively highly, it's got some synergy with the black-white deck too. You know, I think the food option being here is mostly just there for like, well, I'm at 2 or less life, so I guess I'm going to give you food. I think it's interesting, some of these gift cards are designed in such a way where you probably should just do it every time. Then there's a good number that are, you have to sort of feel out the situation, whether you're going to give your opponent a card back is better than you getting an extra permanent back from your graveyard or giving them a fish or whatever. And then there's not that many where you should almost never do it, but this is one of them where you should almost never do it unless you really, really have to. So Nocturnal Hunger is a really good removal spell. And I think Black's best uncommon is Wix Patrol. It's expensive, but it is a lot like the Daring Wave Rider we looked at a minute ago. In fact, they're super similar cards because they both are 6-drops that come down and kill something, but they are dependent on the graveyard. But the good news is, at costing 6 mana for both of them, you're going to have stuff in your graveyard. And Wix Patrol, just to be careful, also mills you. So most of the time it's going to come down, be a 6 mana, 5/3, destroy target creature. And that is very strong. I mean, that's a 2-for-1. It may even get you Threshold because it actually mills you and stuff like that. So, you know, it's just, this is the kind of card that, you know, you don't want that many 5 and 6 drops in your deck. But when there are cards like Wix Patrol or Daring Wave Rider, you kind of do. These are cards that can get you back ahead from behind at uncommon, and that is a hard thing to turn down. All right, let's move to red now. I think red's third best common is Kindle Spark Duo. So another one of these duos. I don't think all of them are like super great, but I do think, you know, we saw a blue one earlier. We've seen a red one make this list of top commons, and I think the green one is probably the best of all of them. So few of them are like legit good commons, but I guess the other 7 or so they're mostly like C-level okay commons that you'll play in those decks, but they're not cards that are premier important for those decks to really get them going. But I don't think that's true about this one, because it is a 3 mana 1/3, bad stat line, but it really does do the things you need it to do in both blue-red and blue-black, or black-red. In black-red, it can help set up all of the you did damage, so you get a bonus things really nicely. And I think in blue-red, it's even better. You know, I have drafted a couple of decks with it already, where it was pretty key to my spell decks doing what they needed to, where I'm just casting like 1 and 2 mana spells that replace themselves, pinging my opponent each time. If you combine this with the Coruscation Otter, Coruscation Mage, I guess is what its name is, like you end up pinging your opponent a ton while you're just ripping through your deck, and seems to be a legit win condition in the format. So it does exactly what blue-red and black-red want to do. Black-red to a lesser extent, since that's mostly an aggro deck, but this is an enabler and it can close out the game. So it is a card that I've liked so far in the format. I think the second best red common is Take Out the Trash. 2 mana, deal 3s at instant speed. It's pretty hard for those to not be premium. You can often trade up with them. You can get 2-for-1s with them because it's an instant. And then this has this raccoon upside where sometimes you get to rummage. And when you can, it feels pretty good. If it always rummaged, I think that would be enough for it to be the best common in red. But it doesn't always rummage. And I think red's best common is actually Alania's Pathfinder. The 4 mana 4/2 that enters, exiles your top card, and then you can play that card until the end of your next turn. So, in other words, it's a 4 mana 4/2 that draws you a card, more or less. And that is a powerful thing. I mean, that's a 2-for-1. The one knock against Alania's Pathfinder is that it has 2 toughness, and your opponent might be able to spend 1 mana to kill it. And if you're really far behind, that might be really bad news. But if you're at parity or ahead, especially, it's just going to give you a 2-for-1. Sure, tempo matters, and it really does. Having 4 mana cards that die to 1 mana spells, not great. But if the game goes long enough, you come out way ahead in that exchange because you got a 2-for-1 and your opponent didn't. So I like the Pathfinder a lot. It also happens to be an otter, which matters. Being a 4/2 does also mean it can swing pretty hard should it survive. Then I think red's best uncommon is Rabid Gnaw. So another removal spell. And I should say, I think both Take Out the Trash and the Pathfinder are first pickable cards, by the way. But anyway, the best red uncommon, I think, is Rabid Gnaw. 1 generic and a red for +1/+0 on a creature, and it does damage equal to its power to another target creature. This would be great in any format because generally it's going to basically be Doomblade. I mean, it's 2 mana to destroy something, but there's a few things going on in this format that make it better. The biggest one is Valiant. So, Valiant triggering is serious value on many creatures in the format, and being able to do it at instant speed, that kind of thing is just completely backbreaking and turns it into a combat trick that often does generate 2-for-1s or at least generate more than 1 card worth of value. And there are times where it can actually work as a combat trick. Those don't line up as often, but, it's kind of like Clear Shot. Obviously, it's not quite as good because it doesn't give the full +1/+1, but it's also 1 mana cheaper, and it gives +1/+0. And there are times where just buffing your creature +1/+0 after your opponent blocks it is enough for it to win combat and survive, and then you also kill something else. That's probably only going to happen like 10% of the time or something, but that's really strong, and the baseline of the card is super efficient removal spell with lots of Valiant upside. It's got spell upside too, just because it's a spell, of course, so blue-red doesn't hate it either. So, Rabid Gnaw is really good. Let's move now to green, where I think the third best common is Sun Shower Druid. So the baseline here is 1 mana, 1/3 that gains you 1 life, which, if that's all it was, and that's what it was 100% of the time, wouldn't be that good of a card, especially in a format that has no super strong counter theme, except, once again, this is a way to trigger Valiant. It's also a way to gain life. I mean, green isn't a color on its own that cares about Valiant or cares about gaining life, but if you pair it with white or black, you might care about gaining life, and if you pair it with red or white, you might have some cards with Valiant. These things do overlap, not as well as this would if this was like a white 1-drop with this effect. It would be a lot better because you care more about gaining life on average in white, but that does matter. Furthermore, in the blue-green deck, which it's supposed to be a part of the most because it's a frog, it is one of the nicer things to just blink over and over again or bounce, because you only have to spend 1 mana to cast it, and you generate more value when you bounce it to your hand or whatever, and it doesn't hurt you tempo-wise as much as sometimes bouncing your other things do. And obviously you get this ETB over and over again, which is powerful. I mean, Early, sure, running it out on 1 as a 1/3 that gains you a life is solid. I mean, it's fine. Like I said, if that's all it ever was, not so good. But then later in the game, you can put the counter somewhere else that's far more relevant. And that's what keeps it, a relevant 1-drop, a 1-drop that looks like it has a lot of power for what it costs. Just does all these little things that I think really add up and have synergy within the format. At number 2, I have Polywallop. So again, this is better in the Frog deck than anywhere, because 3 generic and a green for this removal isn't as good, but it's like passable as a baseline. And most of your green decks are going to have at least a few frogs, and if you're blue-green, this is going to cost 2 or 1 a significant chunk of the time, and that's when it's really powerful. It's also an instant, so, being able to create blowouts with it is a very real thing. And I think green's best common is actually Baker's Bane Duo. That 2-mana, 2/2. I think this is the best of the duos, just because it has sort of the best baseline. I mean, it's a 2-mana, 2/2 that makes a food. I would play that card 100% of the time. We've seen that card before in Limited, and it's performed well, especially in sets where food matters, like this one. And then it also has this expend upside that definitely comes up where it gets +1/+1. It is going to generate, it's not a full-blown 2-for-1. It's a 2-drop. You shouldn't expect too much of that in Limited, especially at Common. But it's more than a card worth the value. Being able to trade off with it and just have a food laying around is plenty good to begin with, and it has way more upside than that. Then I think green's best uncommon, and there's some stuff to talk about here. So I think green's best uncommon is Hunter's Talent. However, I got a card wrong. I read a card wrong in the set review that you might be thinking should be here, and that is Hivespine Wolverine, which I would probably have had as the best green uncommon if I had read it correctly. So it's 5 mana for a 5/4 with 3 options. It can put a counter on a creature you control. It can destroy an artifact or enchantment. Got those parts right. What I didn't get right is that it can only fight creature tokens, which the interesting thing about this is only one person out of all the people who watched the set review left a comment pointing out that I got it wrong. So somehow we all overlooked it. It's not like there's a line break or anything. I don't know how I did it. But that does make it significantly worse. It's still good. I think it's like a B-, and maybe just a flat B, but it's not a B+ like I gave it in the set review. So the title of green's best uncommon very clearly goes to Hunter's Talent, I think. Did draft a deck with 3 of these during early access, and it was as amazing as expected. So up front, this is Rabid Bite, a card you always play. It's a good removal spell. Just getting this down on turn 2 or 3 to kill one of your opponent's creatures is great. Then you can level it up, and it makes a creature into a better attacker every single turn. +1/+0 and Trample is a significant enough boost to really alter combat in big ways. And then if you get to the really late stage of the game, it does exactly what you want to do in the late stage of the game, which is draw more cards. So it ends up being a 2-for-1 most of the time, and it just generates so much value, even though ultimately you sink like 7 mana into it to get all the way to the top. I mean, even when you only spend 4 on it, you're getting kind of insane value, I think, between the removal and the buff one of your creatures every turn effect. The level 3 effect is really only something you do late when you don't have anything else to do. But like I said, that's like exactly what you want in the late game, is an extra card every turn, because that just wins you games late. So this is good at any stage of the game. The one problem it has, of course, like all fight effects and stuff, is, if you don't have a creature in play, it's not good. If you don't have a big enough creature in play, it can be subpar. Does work extra good with Death Touchers, as these effects always do. And it's also nice that, unlike most versions of this effect, you don't get completely blown out if your opponent kills the thing you try to do damage with, because Hunter's Talent sticks around and you'll still get value out of it later. So that's one of the big downsides of a Rabid Bite style spell, and this gets around it to some degree by generating extra value. So I think Hunter's Talent might just be the best uncommon in the format, like full stop. It's definitely going to be in the conversation. I thought it would be going into the format, and at least in my small sample size so far, that's how it's panned out too. It's been a great card. So those are my picks for the best uncommons and commons in Bloomburrow. So far, the format has been really fun. I'm looking forward to drafting it some more this week when it comes to Arena, especially on Tuesday. And again, if you want to see my thoughts on all the cards in the format, that's what the set review is for, so you can check that out. And I'll be back next weekend to talk some more about this brand new format.